Hi everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and today we're going to take a look at a game of mine from the year 2000, way back when, and it was played in another bit of the past. So not only are we going back into history here to the previous millennium, but we're also going to look at a game played in an institution that is now defunct, and that's the Manhattan Chess Club. So the Manhattan Chess Club is really one of the great chess clubs in history, not only in the United States, but really worldwide. And incredibly, despite its tremendous history, despite the huge number of chess players, both of club level and of a titled standard, I mean, international masters, grandmasters, I think I read somewhere that in New York, or let's say New York and the slightly surrounding areas, that's the one city by itself has more grandmasters than any other city in the world, even Moscow. So even if that's not quite true, maybe it is, maybe it's not. Certainly it's up there. I mean, it's probably in the top three. And despite all this, and of course despite the tremendous wealth of the city, this club went out of business. Just a real pity. At any rate, without getting into the politics of it, just say that it's a shame that happened. And so this game was played a couple of years before it closed. Okay, so Bonin, many of you know, probably many of you have played, at least if you're from the United States and are tournament participants, because Bonin is one of these guys who just plays practically non-stop. I think he's averaged somewhere around 300-400 games a year, literally tournament games a year, for every year in the past at least 2 decades. I mean, this guy just loves the game, plays nonstop, and he's had some tremendous successes as well. I mean, I know he's beaten Kamsky on more than one occasion, just to take one very prominent instance. Of course, on the other hand, when you play so often, you have some poor results too, and he's, I would say, probably more people can point to him as their first and maybe only international master scalp. And that naturally happens because, again, of his very frequent play. You know, not only because they get more chances at him, but sometimes you just get yourself played out. But somehow he just maintains his love for the game, and he's able to play, you know, night after night, week after week, seemingly without ever getting tired of it. So it's kind of remarkable, and you know, a testament to the hold that this game can have on all of us. And you know, he's just maybe someone on whom the grip is as strong as possible. All right. Well, I've played it many times myself. My results are not especially thrilling for me. So I think I just have this one win, a few draws, not that many losses, but certainly it's clear that he has the plus score. All right. So I won't. Almost all the games. One game was not very close, but the rest of the games were good fights. In fact, this game was pretty decisive. So, I mean, I lost one game pretty badly. He lost this game fairly badly. And the rest of the games that were decisive, he was able to slowly grind me out. And that's one of the things that he's best at. He is really an outstanding technical player most of the time. All right, so with that background, let's have a look at the game. Okay, so I'm white, e4, e6, c4. Now, you might remember I did a couple of shows on this trappy anti-French line a few weeks ago, and the main line continued with d5, c takes d5, e takes d5, and then queen to b3. And while this is very trappy, and I'll just suggest that you look at those earlier shows to have a look. I think they were titled "Beating the French," and but nevertheless, although it is very trappy, it's certainly not ultimately sound. So black can achieve a good position in many ways. All right. Nevertheless, didn't come up here, so Bonin played c5, and this is an invitation, obviously, to play a Sicilian defense. Okay, so I played knight f3. He played b6, knight c3, a6, and Bonin is really offering to play a kind of hedgehog here. So that's what would happen if I were to play, for example, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and then bishop to b7. So the characteristic hedgehog structure would arise. Let's say I play a move like bishop to e2, and he can play d6, And here we already kind of have a fundamental hedgehog, but I'll make a few more moves here just to make all of the general contours clear. Okay, so f3 protecting the e-pawn, knight b to d7, bishop to e3, say bishop e7, queen d2, castles, rook f to d1, and here we've transposed smack dab right into a regular full-fledged hedgehog. Okay, so what's going on here? What are the typical ideas? Well, the basic idea, I don't really want to go into this too much because the game doesn't end up going into a hedgehog. But I do want to say at least a little bit about it for those of you who are unfamiliar with this opening or setup. You know, it's hard to know what exactly to call it in terms of what kind of thing it is, because it can come up through a variety of different openings. There are different hedgehog positions, but this is perhaps one of the main, if not the main, kind of hedgehog structure. So it's kind of like an English, it's kind of like a Sicilian. Whatever it is, let's discuss the basic points. Alright, so first and most obviously, white has more space. White is putting pieces and pawns all the way up to his 4th rank, while black is only going up to the 3rd rank. So we've got this pretty obvious difference here, and we can say of the 4th rank, or sorry, the 5th rank, that it's kind of no man's land here. So black isn't putting anything there. He might at some point, and white might at some point too, but by and large, this is going to remain unoccupied for a while. Okay, now, what happened to the line? That was interesting. Okay, so we've got our pretty little lines here. Now, that's kind of the space factor. What else is going on? Well, while white has more space, it's rather hard for him to proceed any further, and that's because of these pawns that black has on the 6th rank. So you can see they're covering everything here. So they're covering almost all of these key squares in the middle of the board, which makes it, again, very difficult for white to go at black. And that's why we have this name, the hedgehog. It's it's got its quills, its spines sticking up here, and white is going to get stung by these. He's going to get pricked by these if he tries to go across the board here and get at black. Now, so that's what's difficult for white. But black isn't just going to sit and wait forever. Black will do some maneuvering. Often the queen will go to b8, and let's say the rook goes to e8, and the bishop goes to d8 into d7. But after all this kind of tacking about and remaneuvering, ultimately black usually wants to achieve one of two moves. And that's either b5 or d5, and often both. And the idea behind these pawn breaks is to get rid of white's little gripping pawns here on c4 and e4, the so-called Marozzi bind. So white's pawns are really helping keep black pretty passive, helping to keep him kind of locked up and stuck on just these 3 ranks. So if black can successfully break those pawns down, then he'll have at least his fair share of the board and maybe more. So white is going to engage in this kind of policy of restraint. Black is going to look for a moment where he can kind of break out here. Now, if all white is concerned about is restraint, then he's not going to win the game unless black commits suicide. So how does white make progress? Well, one idea is one that kind of corresponds to black's own ideas, and it's to try to undermine black's structure first. So just to give one typical idea, white will sometimes play b4, knight b6, and then a4 and a5, trying to eliminate this pawn. Because if this guy goes, then it's a lot harder for black to make his breakthroughs. And in fact, white, after getting rid of the b pawn, can then sometimes play c5 and try to crash through. And this occurs especially in a position where black tries to make some progress on the king side. Now, regarding this idea of making progress on the king side, there are a couple of interesting games to look at. So one where it's a complete success is a game played between Bobby Fischer, who actually originated this plan, against Ulf Andersson. At least I think Fischer originated it. It was actually from a game where Fischer had white and played b3 on move 1. So that was, I believe, a TV game played in 1970, and you shouldn't have any trouble finding that. So Fischer against Ulf Andersson. So that's a game where that plan works with just absolute success. Everything works beautifully for white. It's just an absolute model game. On the other hand, a game where Black's attempts to go for some kind of kingside build-up fail, and we see the power of White's queenside breakthrough, is the game Charbonneau against Anand, played, I'm not sure, 2005 or 2006, I think. And it's a very rare loss for Anand to a player who's, well, it's just a rare loss for him, period. But especially rare for him to lose to a player who's definitely not in the world elite. I mean, Charbonneau's a good grandmaster, but he's well below the let's say the standard of the Linares crowd. And in fact, at that point, I'm not even sure if he was a grandmaster. He might have still been an IM at that moment. So, a big upset. And nevertheless, it shows the power of White's plan here with this, the C5 breakthrough. So anyway, take a look at that. Also, for further reference, I would recommend a couple of books to you. Actually, I recommend several. So there are, let's say, 2.5 books I can recommend on the Hedgehog, but also if you have Kasparov's Revolution in the 1970s, or Revolution in the 70s, I think is the title, the first volume of that, he has a chapter on the Hedgehog in there, which may be of some use. More specifically dedicated to the Hedgehog, there are a couple of books by the Romanian Grandmaster Mihail Suba. One is called something like Dynamic Chess Strategy, and that's more or less an autobiography of his, and he spends a pretty fair amount of time talking about the Hedgehog, but it's not all on the Hedgehog. But then there's a volume by him that came out later, which is only on the Hedgehog, and that's called, appropriately enough, The Hedgehog. So if you have a look at that, I think that would be quite useful to you if you're interested in learning more about the system. Also, the Russian Grandmaster Sergei Shipov, Shipov, wrote a book on the Hedgehog a couple of 3 years ago. I don't know its title, and I assume it's in English too, but I might even be wrong about that. But I think it is an English language book. At any rate, enough by way of background, and of course, while I'm plugging things, let me, before I forget, mention my blog. So that's at chessmind.powerblogs.com. So take a look at that. Hope you'll enjoy it. Okay, so no more on the Hedgehog, at least in this show, and back to the game. So after A6, well, okay, indirectly about the Hedgehog. We notice, so I guess I lied a little bit. So you notice here, after F3, White's light squared bishop isn't especially brilliant. So I decided that if I'm going to go for a Hedgehog, I want to go for one where my bishop is going to be a little bit more, its placement will be a bit more lively on G2. It won't be as hemmed in. Okay, so bishop to B7, bishop to G2. And now Bonin made an interesting move, which I hadn't expected. He played B5. Now, if I were to take twice on B5, then he captures my E-pawn, and that's certainly not an even trade by any means. Giving up a central pawn, in a way, two central pawns, because the C-pawn is kind of an auxiliary central pawn. So giving up those two for an A and a B pawn is just, generally speaking, it's going to be a terrible deal strategically. So I played D3, which is a known response to B5 ideas and other positions. Of course, he could take, which he does, but this is actually a mistake, because although he's managed to exchange a wing pawn for a central pawn, the pressure that I'm now going to be able to exert on the D file more than compensates for the loss of this pawn. Well, didn't lose a pawn, but for the loss of a central pawn. All right, so instead Black should have played, well, really anything else almost. Okay, maybe queen to B6 would be the most natural move here. So putting the queen on a good square and simply protecting the pawn. Okay, so BC, DC, knight C6. Now, if Black could gain piece control over the D4 square, then he would be in nice shape, but that's going to prove challenging. All right, so I castled. He played D6. And here, I've more or less finished my development, so take a couple of minutes and see if you can figure out what I should do. I mean, of course, it's not completely finished, but a good part of it is, and we have to figure out, okay, what am I going to do with my heavy pieces? What am I going to do with my bishop? Does it go to E3, F4, G5, something else? B3 and B2, B3 and bishop to B2. I mean, what happens here? So take a minute, see if you can figure out what to do in this position. Okay, well, I'm not going to tell you just yet. So I played queen to a4, which I thought was a reasonable move. Preparing to play rook to d1, and then maybe even play e5 when I'm exerting pressure against the d6 pawn, and possibly against this knight as well. So I'm looking to put my pieces on as aggressive of squares as I possibly can. So it's a useful thing to remember when you're developing that you don't just want to bring your pieces out. So it's not really enough to say that you've properly developed your pieces, that they're no longer on their original squares, but you want to have them places where they're doing things, where they're making threats, where they work together. And so I think queen a4 is a reasonable step in that direction. Okay, so here Bonin played queen to d7. So this, I think, is an inaccuracy. He's bringing the queen out. He's blocking the a4 to e8 diagonal, but it's not really clear that his queen is well placed there. And still, after I play rook to d1, there are going to be threats along the d file. So it probably would have been better for him to play queen to a5. I think I'm just a little bit better here. Nothing too serious. So it's just a game, as they say. Okay, when he played queen to d7, I played rook to d1. He played knight to f6. And again, it's time to figure out what to do here. So bishop f4, bishop g5, bishop e3, something else. So have a look and see if you can figure out what white's move ought to do. And here I would say, take several minutes, because there could be something interesting in this position. I mean, certainly there are the preconditions for there being something interesting. So I've got pressure on the d file. So I mean, this at least encourages thoughts of e5, and you have to see if this works, if it achieves anything at the end of the day. But there's this pressure, there's pressure this way, and of course black's king is not ready to castle just yet, so it gives me, an extra move or so to really make something bad happen, perhaps, to him. So I would say, between the e5 idea, the pressure on this diagonal, the pressure on the d file, and even perhaps pressure on this diagonal as well, this is just the kind of position where you really kind of owe it to yourself to look for something good. All right, it's the kind of position where something strong is just typically going to be present in these kinds of circumstances. Okay, so stop the recording for as long as you need to come up with something, or at least to try to come up with something. All right, well, there are at least 3 moves here that look, I think, reasonably plausible. So there's a move that I played in the game, bishop to f4, which tries to pile up on this pawn on d6, maybe prepares e5 in some cases, so it's certainly a move with some logic. There's bishop to e3, which at first glance doesn't really look very impressive. I mean, it's putting the bishop on not the most exciting square in the world, but the basic point is that there's a threat of bishop takes c5, and it might in fact not be quite so simple for black to defend against this. And then third, there's the move e5. Okay, and this obviously is a very direct and very forceful move. At first glance, it might seem like the obviously best move, but if you look a little further, it might seem that black can neutralize things pretty easily. Okay, so once again, if you didn't come up with all 3 of those candidate moves, let me suggest that you stop again and try to analyze them as much as possible. Okay, well, let's take a look at the move bishop to e3 first. This is actually pretty good. If black plays something like queen to c7, well, now e5 is very, very annoying, and this is in fact quite a good move here. So in this position, I'm in excellent shape. If he plays rook to c8, which is probably best, it's simply accepting the loss of a pawn. So I take, plays knight to a5, queen takes a5. I don't want to trade queens, because then I'm going to have a problem with this c pawn afterward. So it's probably the best move. Well, okay, so let me Yeah, if queen to d7, I think knight takes d7, bishop takes, rook takes, knight c4, and then knight takes b2. So black will regain the pawn, and his rook will in fact be very well placed on the c file, since it's an open file, and he'll gain a tempo because my knight on c3 is going to be hanging as well. So this position is probably okay. And in fact, yeah, it's important that the knight is hanging, because after rook to d4, knight b2, if it wasn't hanging, I would just lose after rook to b1. But actually, even this maybe needs a little examination. Okay, so what here? Probably, well, we should probably throw this check in first. And then maybe knight to c5, maybe even just bishop to c6. So I think I can hold everything together here in time to castle, and then ring my rook over. Or play king e7 and rook over. Okay, so going back here after knight to a5, best is just to take the knight, rook takes, and then might as well take this too and mess up his pawn structure. And here I'm up a pawn. Black doesn't really have full counterplay. He's got the bishop pair. On the other hand, his bishops aren't so great. On the other hand, still, yet again, got to have a lot of hands here apparently. It's going to be tough for me to use my queenside majority, because black can put a pretty fair amount of force against the b4 square. Anyway, I'm up a pawn. Black has a little by way of compensation, but not enough. So it's a clear advantage for white. So bishop to e3 is a good move. However, there's a better move, and it's not the one I chose. So bishop to f4 is pretty well handled by knight to d4. So he's got this nice little trick here. I can't, of course, win a pawn after takes. If I play knight takes d4, c takes, rook takes, then of course e5, and he's winning a piece. So since I can't do that, he's able to kind of consolidate here, really, and make some progress, after which I still have an advantage, but it's only a very small one. So the best move was e5. And then after knight takes e5, knight e5, queen a4, knight a4, bishop g2, and now maybe knight f7. Well, knight f7, bishop f3, rook d3, bishop e4. Yeah, so I have to probably play king takes g2, d takes e5, and black is better. I mean, black's up a pawn. I have some counterplay because I can maybe put some pressure against this pawn on c5, but still, really, despite the fact that his pawn structure is not great, I'm at least the one who has to prove equality here. So this wouldn't really be a very good idea. But after queen takes a4, as Eris Klein pointed out when we were looking at the game afterward, white has the brilliant bishop takes b7, just kind of keeping all of the options open in the position. And now black is in a fair amount of trouble. So perhaps his best is to just return the material, play queen takes d1, and save the rook. And here white is, well, what's the material? So white's got two pieces. Yeah, bishop and a knight for rook and a pawn. And generally that favors the side with the minor pieces, and I would say so here too. White is clearly better in this position and in this situation. Alright, but there are other choices too. Okay, so let's say black plays queen to b4, saving the queen, of course. Okay, well now bishop takes a8, and here, okay, maybe black's best is bishop to e7, but it's the kind of best that is essentially an admission of failure. White's got too much material for the queen. I mean, white has a rook and two pieces for a queen, which is more than enough. Well, for a queen and a pawn, but still. It's definitely to white's advantage here. White should be winning. So let's take a look at d takes e5, which puts black in a good position as far as material goes, but because of the very bad position of his king, he's going to lose. So bishop to c6 check, king e7, bishop g5, with the very nasty idea of rook to d7 check, followed by rook to b7 check, picking off the queen. Okay, so let's say queen to b6. This is probably the only good chance that he's got. Note that queen takes c4 doesn't really help, because although he stops rook to b7, it doesn't stop me from winning the queen with a different retreat. Okay, so queen to b6, and this way, after rook d7, king e8, now rook to b7 is just a blunder because he takes my bishop. However, a position like this, of course, there are multiple strong moves, and the simplest way for white to win here is with just taking on f6, and now black can't take on c6 because rook to d8 is mate, famous Morphy versus Count and Duke style mate, and if g takes f6, then just bishop to a4, and now there's, well, okay, the queen can still hide over on a5, but with black's king in this horrible bind, it's just a very short matter of time before he perishes. Okay, just trying to see if I can find a quick mate. Don't quite see one, but it's pretty close. So like queen a5. Not sure if a7 is the best square, but let's say king d8, rook d1, king c8. And now what? Well, I mean, again, I don't know that I necessarily have to have an immediate win here, because black's position is just simply so bad that something bad will happen to him. And really, of course, I can just keep him. I can try to keep him locked into with rook a to d1, and if bishop to e7, rook to d8 is mate. So that's probably the best way to go about this. And likewise, if bishop to g7, again we utilize this double check, and then rook number 2 goes to d7. So this is probably the right way to do it. Okay, so instead of bishop takes f6, there's another way to win, but alright, we don't need to overkill here. Alright, we'll just show it quickly. Alright, so just for your information there, but the simplest and obvious human way to play is just takes, bishop a4, and the game is functionally over. Okay, so going back here to this position after the sacrifice, so we've looked at queen takes d1, trying to return some material, and queen to b4. Queen a5 is, at least at first glance, the best try. So again, bishop takes a8, d takes e5, check here. And now the difference is that if bishop to g5, threatening rook to d7, black can play queen c7, and if white tries to cash back in here, when we count up the dead bodies here at the end of the day, it turns out that black is a pawn up. So this is kind of like the line that we looked at before, and you know, black is a little bit better. White has some compensation for the pawn he's down, but not full compensation. So with the queen on a5, and with the ability to retreat to c7 in case of bishop to g5, it seems at first like black has a chance to be okay. Given a couple more moves, he plays g6 maybe, and bishop to g7, or perhaps h6, g5, and bishop to g7. The reason being, if you just played g6, maybe bishop to g5 is stronger there. Okay, well, let's have a look here. So bishop to e3, and if black plays queen to b6, bishop a4, queen c7. Well, white can just finish bringing his pieces into the game, and it turns out that it's good enough. I mean, black really can't quite untangle in time. Now what white needs to do is to get rid of this knight, so the rook can go to d7 under the under maximally favorable circumstances. So f3, knight e4, and black is losing here. The threat, of course, is to play bishop takes c5, which is just wins the queen. If knight takes e4, then rook to d7 wins the queen. So black's best is probably just rook c8. Still loses the queen, but he gets the most that he can for the material. But after b3, black is down a full exchange, and in a way, kind of functionally speaking, more because of the doubled e-pawns. So it'll take white some time, and because the obstacles are bishops, maybe black can cause some practical problems, but realistically speaking, this is a fairly simple win for white. Alright, so with e5, have to go back a long way though, white can win. Alright, and I think it just about is a forced win, or very close with this move, but alright, seeing the queen sack and then being able to calculate it out was at least beyond what I was able to do in a game 25. So I played bishop f4, Bonin played knight to d4, and now the position is close to even. Oh, just some unfinished business. back here. So I had challenged you guys to see what the best move was. Queen A4 is what I played, and it's not a bad move, but E5 was good here too. So I should have stopped to point that out. All right, and again, the Queen A4 ideas come into play here. So if, let's say, D takes, or let's say Knight takes E5, Knight takes E5, okay, Bishop takes G2 is probably forced here. Well, now I think I can play Queen A4 check. And no winner position is any good, so he's pretty much got to play King to E7. And this, I think, should be rather uncomfortable for him. All right, so I'm sacking a pawn. Well, I don't even have to sack a pawn. I can play Knight takes F7. But I don't think I even want to play Knight takes F7 because it kind of lets his king out of the most dangerous area. So let's say King takes, D takes E5, Rook to D1. Now he's got to keep the D7 square protected. But then I also have possibilities of following up. Let's say if he plays Queen C7, maybe I can play Bishop to E3 and then Knight to E4 and pressure this pawn tremendously. So I definitely like White's position here. I mean, I think this is not winning for me, but it's troublesome for Black, at least. Okay, so moving on here, Bishop F4 takes. We already pointed out that I can't play Knight takes, so I just played Rook to D2. And the reason for Rook to D2 is that I want to play Bishop to E3. So I don't want to allow his knight to sit here. I mean, it's a great piece, and if he can just keep it there forever, then I'm in trouble. So if I play Bishop to E3 right away, then he plays Knight C2. I'm not happy with that. My pawns are going to get destroyed, and I'm giving up the bishop here. Okay, and I don't want to play Rook A to C1 either, for the simple reason that my Rook is just doing absolutely nothing on C1. So, okay, it enables Bishop to E3, but it's a silly square for my Rook. So Rook to D2 is, I think, clearly the right move, preparing to double, and also preparing Bishop to E3. And the point of all of this is that if Black plays E5, I don't mind that, because then I get the D5 square. Alright, so he played Bishop to E7, now I play Bishop to E3. He took, I took, Knight E5, Bishop E2, got to protect my C-pawn. He castled, I played Rook A to D1, so I've managed to maintain a small edge here. Nothing tremendously serious. But, okay, again, I've kept just a small space advantage, some pressure on the D file, so life is alright. Okay, I played Bishop to F3, shoring up the E-pawn. He played Knight to A5, and I think this is slightly dubious, though I think the motivation behind it is good. So let's go back here and ask, well, you know, what can Black do by way of creating a positive plan in this position? And it's, well, frankly difficult to find anything that he can do here. Why? Well, what would he like to do? What can he do to try to free his game? White's pressure is pretty heavy against this pawn on D6, and it's just about impossible for him to play D5. So there's not really anything to be done there. What else could he do as far as the pressure on the D-file goes? Well, one thing he could try to do is block the D-file. So if he could safely put his knight on D4, then he'd be in fine shape. Alright, but how exactly is he going to do that? The only clear way would be by first playing Bishop to F6, but that hangs the D-pawn. So that's maybe a bit of a difficulty. Although there could be some circumstance under which he's able to make that work. I'm not sure. But probably he's going to have to defend the D6 pawn again beforehand. So what Bonin's idea here was with Knight to A5, I think, is to try to find a hook in my position for him to use. And it's not the C pawn, but rather after B3, which I played. He then played Bishop to C6, and I think his idea was someday to play Knight to B7, A5, A4. And in this way, he does gain some chances for counterplay, at least if I'm not careful. So that, I think, was his idea, and it's not bad. Alright, so I played King to F2, and here he decided, well, so part of the reason why I'm doing this is that it's just kind of a generic tidying up move. So my bishops on E3 and F3 are loose. It may not mean anything, but typically when tactical, in advance of tactics becoming possible, if you can have all of your pieces protected, then that certainly puts you in much better shape. And I'm also centralizing my king a little bit. So it's a useful move, but I also had a sneaky idea behind it as well. And here, maybe black would have been best served by playing knight to b7 with the idea that I mentioned already. But though it's not clear how well that'll work. So let's say, for example, he does play knight to b7, and I don't know. Let's say I make some pass move like king to e2. Okay, if he plays a5, I think this is actually not going to work out so well because I can play a4 and then knight to b5, or at least play knight to b5 at some convenient moment. So he's not going to be able to use the b file because I can clog it up, and his knight on b7 is, at least for offensive use, incredibly stupid. Though, again, he can maybe do some remaneuvering. So maybe the rook goes to c8, the bishop goes to d7, the rook goes to c6, the knight goes to d8, rook goes to b6, knight goes to c6, and then to b4. I'm not sure what it's doing on b4 either, but you know, some kind of long-winded idea like this might be possible. Just trying to show that the knight isn't going to be bad on b7 forever. And then further, maybe if I play knight to b5, when he takes, maybe I'm making some concession either way. So if a takes b5, a4, so I'd probably play c takes b5, but then d5 might be more possible, though I've got an awful lot of lumber aimed at that square still, so that'll prove challenging for him. At any rate, the point is just that the game continues. I like my position. I'm certain that I'm better here, but the fight goes on. All right, so black played king to fa here, though, and now, once again, try to figure out what white's move ought to play. So I've got a nice position, but I have to be able to do something with it. Otherwise, we're just going to look at each other and the game will be drawn, or even worse, if I just do nothing long enough, he'll come up with some idea and slowly starts outplaying me. So what should white's move do? Okay, well, the answer is that I have a nice little tactical shot which takes advantage of his king being on f8, and that's e5. And so now we see the point behind king to f2, or one point behind king to f2, and it's that my bishop on f3 is not hanging here. Alright, so let's take a look at the variations. If he plays d takes e5, then I just keep taking on d8 until he recaptures with the bishop. Then I have bishop c5 with check. See, if his king's on g8, it's just a big exchange. Maybe it's a good exchange for me, but I'm not winning any material out of it. But here I am, bishop c5 check, king e8, f takes e5, and I am keeping that e-pawn, even though it's slightly weak. So white's just winning here. Okay, in the game after e5, he played bishop takes f3. I played king takes f3. And again, if he plays d takes e5, it's just the same story. I keep taking on d8 until his bishop recaptures, and then I play bishop c5, and then I take. And here too, I can keep my pawn. So if bishop to c7, maybe I can play bishop to d6. Let me think about this. Pretty sure I can, but I might be wrong about that. Yeah, because knight e4, and then he has f5, but knight to g5. Not sure. h6, threatening f5. c5 doesn't work here because then the c pawn is going to hang. Alright, so after takes, okay, yeah, so the point is not to do that, but probably just to play king to e4, and on knight to c6, play bishop to d4. Yeah. So this should be sufficient. And actually, here I can play bishop to d6, so I don't need a retreat. So just bishop d6 now, because takes, and there's no the knight's not on b7, so I don't have to worry about any problems when I play c5. So king d7, c5, and white should win pretty easily, frankly. So he is not going to be able to regain my e-pawn, or regain the pawn, which is on e5. So in the game, Bonin played knight to b7, trying to hold on to the d6 pawn, and also it's protecting the c5 pawn too. But this is ultimately inadequate as well, and if you haven't already figured out why, now's a good time to do so. Okay, the answer, as I hope you've figured out, is that I just keep taking on d6 until I can play bishop takes c5 with a pin. So rook takes d6 is what happened. I played rook takes d6, bishop takes d6, rook takes d6, just the same, and here my opponent resigned. There's really just no chance for black. He plays knight takes d6, bishop takes c5, and if I have two pieces and a pawn for rook, that's just an incredibly easy win. No real challenge there. And of course the problem is that he can't keep his material. So if he tries to defend it, let's say he plays king to e7, well, I just cash in whenever I want to. So let's say b4, and alright, I don't even know what black is supposed to play here. I don't know. What can we even try? The problem for black is that he can't even escape the pin without just losing the knight for nothing. But alright, just to make a move. Okay, so f6, and now let's just go ahead and cash out. I don't have to cash out yet, but this position is going to be an easy win. So we'll even let black have a passed pawn here. Takes, c5, king e6, a4, and this is going to be very easy for white to win. Simply up a pawn with an outside pass, or in fact there will be two outside passed pawns that are connected. So very, very easy win for white. So it's kind of funny. The e5 was this recurring theme throughout the game. I could have played it back here on move 10, and then a few moves later I could have played it on move 12. So this would have been best here as well. And then ironically enough, I had a third chance to play e5 under ideal circumstances, and this time I did it, and it won. So what can we ascertain from this? Well, one thing that we can learn from this is the value of pawn breaks, and also, well, definitely that, and pawn breaks with respect to this particular structure as well. So clearly black is weakest. Okay, the a6 pawn is a theoretical weakness, but it's very hard for me to get to it, so that's not really so serious. But these two guys, while they offer black good control over these central dark squares, they're also a bit brittle. So if I can play e5 safely, it makes the c5 pawn pretty weak, and even if I wasn't just winning it right away, it's a very easy pawn for white to gang up on too. And even, let's say, in the worst circumstance where it ends up just being a trade. So I play e5, he takes, I take with the f pawn, he wins that at some point, and I win his c pawn. Even there, the 3-on-1 queenside majority can be better than black's 4-2 kingside majority, in part because of the outside pass pawn factor. Okay, so it's an interesting game, and also this e5 break, I think, is in some ways reminiscent of what I was mentioning before about the c5 break against the hedgehog. Again, for that, see the Charbonneau-Anand game. So hopefully this was at least useful and educating you with respect to at least a couple of interesting and reasonably common pawn structures. And also there were some neat tactical points that I hope you enjoyed and got some good exercise trying to work out for yourself. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll see you next week. Take care.